And we're now go inertial. The navigation system is activated. Auxiliary power units have started. Solid rocket motor nozzle gimbal checks are underway. Ignition system is armed. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
You're listening to the Survive to Thrive radio network. Survive, the number 2, thrive.net. Thank you for your attention. The following broadcast is brought to you by the good people at enerfood.com. That's ENERFOOD.com. This broadcast is not intended to be used as medical advice. The FDA, the WHO, the WTO, and the U.S. federal government has prohibited us from making certain claims and truths. You are now locked into Total Health Freedom with Darren Craddock, a twice-weekly analysis of news and information designed to help you achieve optimum health and expose the international tyranny keeping us sick and more easily controlled by the powers that be. Darren has traveled the world, learned from masters, and believes in you. Now, here he is, the man with the plan, Darren Craddock.
Good evening, folks. This is Darren Craddock back here for Total Health Freedom, and I am very excited this evening to have our guest, G. Edward Griffin, on the line. We have a lot of interesting things to talk about, folks. We are in a situation the last couple of days here. We should all be feeling happy, right? They've figured out a deal on this debt ceiling, so we should all be sighing, basically breathing a sigh of relief. Well, my belief is it's quite the opposite. And I'm very excited to have G. Edward Griffin on to help us understand a little bit about what's really going on with the finances of our nation and some suggested movements forward for ultimately what we all want to create, and that is financial stability, but from I think a point of view more of individual hard work, but individual decisions to move our country forward based on the republic that it was initially intended to be, rather than where we are today. G. Edward Griffin, may I call you Ed?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Ed, thank you so much for coming on this evening. I'm very grateful for you being on the show. What's truly going on with this debt ceiling deal?
Oh, the debt ceiling. Well, I certainly agree with your brief summary there, Darren. But, you know, to the average person out there, they hear the word debt ceiling, and I don't think people realize what that really means. I mean, it's obvious. It means a limit as to how much debt you can go into. But underneath those words, there's a reality, and that the reality is that the ship is sinking because it has so many holes in the hull. We'll call those holes debt, okay? The ship is in serious trouble because it's got too much debt now, and it's going down. And so now the captain and the crew is saying, what we need are a few more holes, guys. And because if we don't drill some more holes, why, this ship may sink. Well, with a couple of more holes, the likelihood of it sinking becomes even greater. So that is basically what we're dealing with here in this debt ceiling. People talk about we can't have a default, can we? Well, the truth of the matter is that we're going to have a default, and we're having a default either way. That ship is going down either way. It's going to go down faster or slower, but it's going down either way. And when I say we're going to have a default either way, is because if we didn't raise the debt ceiling, if we didn't go into greater debt, well, then everything would be out in the open, and the government wouldn't be able to make its payments that it's promised to, debt on its bonds and its treasury bills and so forth, and wouldn't be able to to issue all the checks to everybody that they've been sending around. And that would be terrible. But now, by raising the debt ceiling, what have they done? They've borrowed more money from the banks, the Federal Reserve System. They've created money out of nothing. And now Uncle Sam's got more money to spend, and it's flooding into the economy. And what that is doing is it's causing a flood of the money supply even more so than it was before, so that inflation is going to accelerate, and the default is being passed on to the taxpayers. That's all. It's being passed on to all of the taxpayers instead of just some of those who are getting government checks. And that's really about all that's happening is who's going to pay for the default? Well, as it turns now, the whole country is going to pay for it. And the ship is going down. That's the bottom line. So how can you be happy either way? This is a really bad scenario. But the idea of everybody cheering that they have that they're going to put some more holes in the ship, it's just absolutely insane. It shows to me that people don't really understand the reality of what this debt is doing to the country.
No, I really think that's absolutely true. And I mean, on some levels, there are some people piping up saying, well, you know, there's certain forces that really held government to task to make them at least include some level of responsibility of getting debt down long term. But when we really look at the extent of the debt that the country's in currently, and that's just what's stated. That's without all of these weird derivatives that really, if you look at all of that, we're in much worse shape than what we're being told. But that in the long term, we're in a situation where, okay, it's good to look at putting some more responsibility to include debt reduction methods, but we're in such a hole, the ship is sinking so much, that is there a way out? But I mean, all of this relates to the Fed, right?
Well, that's how all the money is created, of course. They can't just go get this money from lenders because nobody's willing to lend money to the government anymore. So they just have to go to the Fed, and the Fed just creates it out of nothing. That's how it's happening. So the total money supply is being expanded. But you know, you mentioned about these so-called measures to have some kind of restraint in the future. It's appalling to me. Why does anybody believe any of that? Has the federal government ever shown restraint on debt, ever in its past, or at least in a lifetime of any of us alive, and probably puts me at the head of the class there. I mean, they haven't held their promises before to restrict the debt. What makes us think that they've given us some new promises now, and they're going to keep those? That's about as naive as you can get.
No, absolutely true. I mean, the Fed, there's been so much mystery around the Fed for so many years that only I think really people are starting to realize, the general public is starting to realize the incompetence of the Fed. But I think most people have no idea what they can do as individuals to change the system as it is, because the Fed has come to exercise ultimate control, basically, over our monetary policy and financial health. So, ultimately, can we even achieve stability with the current model? It seems not, because in 1971 we moved off the gold standard, and there's nothing really backing the currency. I mean, if in our nation, the Fed can literally print as much money as they want, and with QE1, QE2, and it would seem probably QE3 coming along, it's a perpetuation of the same folly, one year after another.
Of course, and it's been going on for a long, long time. The process started back in 1913 when the Federal Reserve System was created. And your question is right to the point, Darren. As long as the Fed exists, can we ever really solve the problem? And my answer is no. That's why I'm one of those people that says, let's quit messing around. Let's quit calling for auditing of the Fed. Let's abolish the darn thing. It's got to go. It's as long as it exists, it gives politicians and bankers the power over our money supply. It allows them to create money out of nothing. It allows them to create interest on nothing. It allows them to provide a river of gold that they can direct into anybody's pockets they wish. And they can buy politicians, they can buy corporations, they can buy the loyalties of men because they have unlimited access to funding. As long as this mechanism exists, the people who run that, the politicians and the bankers at the pinnacle of that instrument, are going to use it to control the nation. And now their eyes are set upon the world. The answer to your question, in my view, is no. As long as we've got the Fed, we cannot solve this problem.
Right, and there are some politicians who've been calling for the abolition of the Fed for much time. I mean, Dr. Ron Paul is definitely one of them that many of us have heard of. Yes. And yet he's kind of portrayed as being a maverick, almost like, why would anyone want to abolish the Fed? And yet I often ask myself, how could anybody looking at our current financial dilemma not want to abolish the Fed? They obviously don't know what they're doing, or actually, perhaps they do know what they're doing, and this is all intentional.
Well, there are a few in that category. That's certain. You know that the people at the pinnacle, as I said a moment ago, the people who run the Federal Reserve System, and of course the leading politicians who are in partnership with them, they certainly know what it's all about, and they know that if the Fed were to be abolished today, that tomorrow they would lose probably about 95% of their influence and power. So they're going to fight abolishing the Fed. They're going to fight that to the death. But, you know, almost everybody else, from that little rare high view up the top all the way down at the bottom, people don't understand what the Fed is, and they're confused. They think that if we abolish the Fed, that somehow we'd be getting rid of a great American institution, you know,
right,
like motherhood. And they don't realize that the Federal Reserve is nothing but a banking cartel. And that's all it is. It's
right,
no different than a banana cartel or an oil cartel. It's a banking cartel. You can still buy bananas without a banana cartel. You can still buy oil without an oil cartel. All the cartels do is make sure that you're paying more for those things than you would in a free market. And that's all that that the banking cartel does. We're paying more for credit. We're paying more to maintain a money supply by far than if it was an honest free market.
Right, and the Fed is really ultimately when it was created in 1913 was the third big attempt, and a successful attempt, although it took a couple of years for it to become a successful attempt, for certain forces to put into place a central bank, so to speak, that the first two times, you know, didn't really last very long because the people had the wisdom to realize that it was really against the principles of the founding fathers. But in secret, I believe it came into power in 1917, I think, but it was the initial meetings were in 1913. Could you give us a little bit of the history so people can understand a little bit more about how it managed to come into power in the first place?
Well, yes, I think that history is important. It may bore some people, but I think it's pretty important. And I'd like to start from the tail end of that, which is that yes, the first a couple of attempts at a central bank were defeated. I mean, they came into existence, and then the charters expired, and they were not renewed by Congress because there was strong public sentiment against them. But that came in a period of time when the franchise, and let's say the vote, was restricted to people who had a serious interest in their country. In those days, the vote, not everybody voted. And people say, well, the women didn't vote. And that's true. I'm not saying the women shouldn't vote. But I'm saying a lot of people didn't vote. Primarily, it was just those who paid taxes who were the voters. In other words, can you imagine how absurd that is? I mean, only those who put in the money have control over how the money is spent. Well, in those days, that's pretty much what it was. Those who paid the taxes and those who had the property paid the taxes. They were the ones that had the vote. And so and that means that they were pretty well-informed people. They were experienced people. They understood things like money. They knew a little bit about history. They were actively interested in politics. They weren't watching Dancing with the Stars or Saturday football. They were very serious people about the fate of their country. Today, you compare that, everybody votes, and especially those, you know, the votes that go to people on the dole, that exceeds the number of votes that are cast by those who put up the money for the dole. So the whole thing has been swung around so that today the people who are making decisions generally are those who have no interest in history, no knowledge of history. They can't be bothered with finding out what's really going on in the economy. They're uninformed about the nature of money. They don't know. In other words, they're like little children playing in a sandbox, and they're being given the power of decision of the fate of the nation. And this is the reason that demagogues can do so well in our system today, and I certainly would include the leaders of the Federal Reserve System as being demagogues. But anyway, all of this came about because the Federal Reserve System is, actually America's fourth central bank. It's not the first. We've been through all of that before. The first one existed at the very time that the country was formed. But it didn't last but a couple of years. It created so much debt, and it lost investors' money and everything else, and they just let the charter expire. And then there was another one. The first Bank of the United States, and that expired. And then, of course, Andrew Jackson fought the big war against the Bank of the United States. It was another central bank, exactly like not exactly, but almost exactly like the Federal Reserve System. And that was the last time any real serious opposition was developed against the central bank, when President Jackson led the public opinion against the central bank, and he exposed them. He said, "These are a den of vipers. They're controlling the nation's money and the nation's credit. They're stealing money from the American people. They control the expansion and contraction of the money supply." And he had it pretty well nailed. And the head of the bank at that time was Nicholas Biddle, and he decided to pull out all the stops. And he started to create an artificial depression right in the middle of Andrew Jackson's campaign against the bank. Andrew Biddle started to call in all the loans and call in the money, shorten the money supply, shrink it, knowing that this would cause great negative repercussions in the economy, be bad for business. And he did it deliberately so he could say, "You see, you start messing around with the venerable central bank, and look what it's doing to the economy. President Jackson is creating this problem. Get him out of office. He's the guy that's doing this, And it almost worked. In fact, it would have worked. People they were even talking about impeaching Jackson because of what he was doing to the economy, not realizing that it was Biddle himself that was doing it. And it almost worked, but except for the fact that some people on the inside leaked the information out, and it got into the press that these were conscious decisions made by the head of the central bank himself, Nicholas Biddle. And when that finally hit the press and the people read about it, they understood immediately what the problem was, and Biddle was forced out and left in disgrace. And Jackson was successful, and the second Bank of the United States went out of existence. And then we didn't have a central bank for a good many years, and that was the period of time when the nation really prospered greatly. And then all of a sudden, back in 1913, whammo, these guys come back. Another generation had passed away. Everybody who remembered the lessons of history was now either dead or too old to put up much of a fight. A new generation had come along. By this time, radio was popular, sports was popular, everybody was having a good time. Nobody cared about paying any attention to their government or didn't stop learning about economic matters in school. People were forgetting how to even multiply and divide. The whole dumbing down of America was well underway. So by the time 1913 came along, the guys were able to push it back in. For the fourth time, the United States got a central bank, and we've had it ever since. And that's the history. It's a very fascinating history. You'll find it all in my book. But the details really make it so clear that we're not dealing with anything here except, as Andrew Jackson called them, a den of vipers.
Right, and they are a den of vipers. And I believe at the time when the Fed was created, the people involved in its creation under secrecy at that time controlled 1/4 of the wealth globally, not just in the United States, but globally. So
right.
This was a concerted global decision to usurp the power of a nation that essentially rivaled the other models worldwide. And it's been ultimately a gradual derision or weakening of what this nation stands for by the control of the financial system, gradually taking the power away and instituting more of a, I guess, collectivist model rather than a model that respects individual rights.
Right, you are.
Yeah.
So
abolishing the Fed. Let's look at this a little bit in more, because obviously that if we want to move forward, that's something we have to do. I know that Dr. Ron Paul have been calling for, and I think even managed to achieve an audit of the Fed, and I think that's brought some more awareness. But how could we move forward from your point of view to achieve an abolition of the Fed?
Well, the first thing is we have to get most of those congressmen and senators who are now in office, we have to get them out of there. That's the harsh reality, because when you look at these guys, their political careers are too dependent upon the economic powers involved in the Fed. Now, when I say economic powers, I don't necessarily mean just the banks, but you must realize that these banks are the ones that have provided the loans to the giant corporations as well, and quite often you'll find members of the bank board sitting as members of the board on these other corporations. It's kind of an interlocking directorate. You find the same people showing up here, there, everywhere. It's a network, and they control the major media outlets: ABC, CBS, NBC, Turner Broadcasting. You find them on, all the Washington Post, the Washington Times, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, so forth. So, and these guys in Washington who are in office know that they have to be friendly with this power, or they're not going to be elected. And that's the reason you don't really find much political interest in abolishing the Fed, because these guys know that the minute they start to do that, they're going to lose their financial support. They're going to be in the press. They'll be called nutcases, just like they call Ron Paul. Anybody that questions the Fed is going to get a very bad reputation in the press all of a sudden. And so these guys are not going to turn against the Fed. You say, how are we going to abolish the Fed? And the answer is we've got to abolish the puppets of the Fed first, get those guys out of the office and replaced with people who understand the basics that we're talking about. So that means our job is really political and cleaning house and getting a new slate of candidates in position.
So it means a kind of grassroots activism, I guess, more than anything, and that activism is kind of interesting because you see the current president, who obviously is very much friends with the Fed and has helped perpetuate their policy. Currently, we're at a situation where the debt's probably 10 times more than it was when he came into office, and there's all these excuses left, right, and center for why. But I think in some ways, his election represented an amazing achievement in grassroots activism. That same activism, using email, using blogging, using Facebook, can be used in a modern manner to get people active, to call for the kind of change that we really need to achieve a truly stable economy and a truly free society.
I agree with that, and I don't think that alone is sufficient, but I think it's a very important new tool that's available, and that's one of the reasons, of course, that the elitists who are running the show today are very nervous about the Internet, and one of the reasons they keep advancing proposals for new laws, new regulations, supposedly to protect the American people from terrorists and child pornographers and all that sort of thing. We know that really what they want to do is just get their hands on the switches so they can turn off websites and sources of information from anybody that the government deems to be unacceptable. So they're working very hard to pull the skids out from underneath that process. But I agree that right now the Internet is still free enough in this country that it can be used. But unfortunately, those guys in Washington are trying to go as fast as they can to adopt the Chinese model. And as you know, in China, there are many words you can't even put up on the internet. If you search in China, if you search for the word freedom, you don't get any hits. Things like that. You know?
It's astonishing, and what's interesting is that from my understanding, and we've actually been the recipients of this kind of treatment with our website, is that there are groups of workers on a daily basis trying to take down the pinnacles of freedom and individual prosperity and business building, and medium and small sized businesses in the United States are actually becoming victims of basically internet hackers that are going on and taking down websites, and this is happening on a day-to-day basis. So that collectivist mentality is actually almost that of China is becoming an aggressive endeavor to take over the world in a collectivist manner without using the sword, but rather using savvy intellect in a destructive manner.
Absolutely. These fellas are smart enough to know, well, fellas and gals too, but they're smart enough to know that it's much easier to control a population if you control the information that they get. That way you can control their opinions. They call it, opinion engineering. That's much easier than having to put down rebellion with swords and bayonets. Just put it down by denying access to information and letting the people think that they're in the minority and that everybody else thinks that they're a nutcase and so forth, and so that they're cowed and intimidated into silence. And so that's the weapon of choice today, is the control of information.
Right, and with all of the major media outlets being controlled by the same people that run the banking cartels, and also some of the large corporations such as Monsanto that basically gets government to write policy in their favor, which is against the benefit of the people. We've got all sorts of terrible health repercussions coming from genetically modified foods, etc., etc. Plus, I know you've been very involved in, and I'd like you to talk some more about that too, in spraying, aerosol spraying that's causing a major descent in our ability to produce healthy food.
Yes. So there is a multiple attack. There's no question about it. And what we see is something that, 20 years ago, I don't think I could have imagined in my wildest fantasy for a science fiction story of how an international network of power groups, a blend of governments and corporations and think tanks and banks, could all blend together and begin to create one a centralized controlling brain with arms, by the way, with the access to police forces and armies to enforce its will. It's not just a brain; it's got hands and feet. Anyway, I never would have thought 20 years ago that we could see something like that in our lifetime, and now it's so clear. Everywhere you look, you can see the structure being built around us.
Yeah, it's George Orwell's 1984, basically not just on paper anymore. It's become a reality for much of the world.
That's so true.
Yeah.
And people sometimes ask, when is the New World Order going to happen? And my answer, of course, is, well, it's already happened, folks. It's just a question of it's growing and maturing and getting more and more powerful. But it's not going to happen someday when they ring the bell and say, today, on Thursday at noon, the New World Order will be here. It arrived, a long time ago, and it's very embryonic form, and it's been growing, and it's pretty big right now.
Right, and I think that, with multiple media outlets, for the majority of media outlets in favor of such a progression towards this globalist view and this globalist model, it's so controlling because it creates an idea in the public's mind that this is a good thing. This is what we should be doing because it's a humanitarian thing to do. It's the right thing to do. And so people gradually become lulled into a belief that what's being fed to them is the right way to go. And it's basically perpetuated and enhanced through the educational systems worldwide, through media. And before people know it, they're actually living in this world that George L. Orwell was talking about, 20-something, 30 years ago almost, So
right.
We're going to go to break right now. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Thank you so much for being on, and be right back.
Okay.
We beat the enemy. We show them how strong we are. Though we kill a million people, we're always ready for them.
With natural and man-made disasters and economic turmoil, if we don't get well prepared, we will most certainly regret it. Good readiness must include storage of high-quality food that will build us up rather than tear us down. Much of the storable food available is full of bad fats, salt, sugar, nutrient-poor refined foods, and even MSG. In response, EnerHealth Botanicals has created our 40-day and 40-night 100% organic preparedness pail. It's GMO-free and has a 10 to 20-year shelf life if stored at 60 degrees or less. Some of the items need cooking, some can be eaten dry, while some can be soaked and sprouted. These are selling out fast at third the price of storable food packages. Call us at 866-762-9238. That's 866-762-9238. Or go to enerfood.com, ENERFOOD.com. 866-762-9238. Or go to ENERFOOD.com.
You're listening to Total Health Freedom with Darren Craddock, sponsored by the good people at enerfood.com. Natural answers for your health, wealth, and well-being. Now, here's Darren Craddock.
Hi, this is Darren Craddock with Total Health Freedom, and my guest, EDWARD Griffin. Ed, I'd like to kind of move to wrapping up the subject that we were talking about. And many people wonder why on my show I cover things, that look at the economy, debt, etc., when I'm, I basically portray myself to be having a health show. But to me, true health and total health is a measure of our health, not just in our body, but in our minds, in our spirits. It's really literally a holistic view, if you like, that if we want to have a healthy, prosperous, and successful life, we have to take care of multiple areas of our lives and not just think, by taking herbs that improve our digestive health, suddenly we've got all the answers. We literally need to look at multiple areas of our lives, and not just our own personal individual lives, but how our government is run and how we can influence and change by our individual decisions. It seems to me that the Fed, the global banking cartels, what they're doing is they collapse one economy, build up another. Then they'll collapse another economy, then build up another. And they create within the people a desire for some benevolent government that will come and save them, when truly the salvation is in the individual. It's in us getting up off our feet, getting up off our butts, basically, and saying, you know what? It's not up to the government to save me. It's up to me to save myself.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more on that, Darren. And before I comment on that, I'd like to go back a little notch and comment on your observation of the necessity of talking about monetary and social and political issues as well as health. I came into this from the other side. My first interest when I became really aware of what's going on in the world was on the geopolitical, political and economic and social issues. And after I had done that, and I had written my first couple of books, I wrote my first book on the United Nations, which of course gets us right into the heart of it. I wrote a book on the Supreme Court and their decisions and so forth. But after I'd been pretty well on the road for a while, I became interested in the area of health and nutrition, mainly because a friend of mine who was an MD in the San Francisco area, Dr. John Richardson, was getting into trouble with the medical establishment because he was using an unauthorized treatment for cancer. Didn't make any difference that he was saving lives. That was not the important thing. The important thing as far as the medical society was concerned and the board was that this substance wasn't approved by the FDA, and therefore it was automatically classified as quackery and so forth. So that's when I became aware for the first time that freedom of choice in medicine was also important, and that finally I came to the conclusion, and by the way, some people were saying, Ed, why don't you just stick with what you know? Just stick with these freedom issues. Let others take care of these health issues. Nobody cares about that. And I stuck my ground, fortunately, because I said to myself, and then openly I said, what good is it to have freedom if you're sickly and you can't enjoy the freedom? And then vice versa, what good is it to be healthy if you're spending your life in a slave labor camp? So in order to understand and enjoy the fulfillment of life, you've got to have both freedom and health.
That's true.
Yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to confirm what you said. I think most people come to that conclusion after a little contemplation. And
right. And I think what's interesting is that, and this is, again, really revolving around some of the same issues we've been discovering, but part of the same manipulation that's going on is that the media creates a desire for material satisfaction. And not that I'm saying it's wrong in any way to satisfy your material desires, of course, within balance, and that's your own choice individually. But the danger there is that for many people, when we strive to satisfy our material desires, very often we have very little time left to contemplate our health, contemplate the political system we live in, contemplate our family and the state of our family and the state of our nation. And so part of that manipulation, that desire that's created through media, is to have the next best car, the next best house, be in the next best school district, be in blah, 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 blah. And then, ultimately, people wake up and they're in a society that they never believed they could be in, lacking the freedoms that they believed were intrinsically theirs. We look at the Patriot Act, for example, and suddenly the people wake up wondering what on earth happened.
Yeah, and they wake up and how shall I say this accurately, at that late stage in life, as it often is, they have no way ever to find out what happened or why it happened, because they've missed the boat already. They've missed a lifetime of observation, education, contemplation, understanding. They come into it, the game is already over. And all they want to know is, well, how are we going to get out of it? Who are you going to vote for? And that's about the extent of the average American's awareness of solving these problems. Who are you going to vote for? Which party? And they don't want to go beyond that. Well, that's no accident, because that's the way we've all been trained. We were all brought up in government schools, and that's just what the government wants us to do.
We've literally been trained to believe, and for some people this may sound like sacrilege, what I'm about to say, but we've been trained to believe that democracy is the ultimate model, when in reality, true democracy cannot be achieved by the vote. I'm not saying the vote doesn't have its importance and its place. However, it really takes away from the individual participation in the reality that unfolds before one's very eyes, because if one believes that by voting in a new party or by voting in a new representative, be it senator, be it congressperson, be it a president, be it the Supreme Court, that somehow everything's going to be okay and we don't have to participate. But a non-participatory system where all the decisions are made by elected officials puts all the power in the hands of the elected officials and takes all the power away from the individual.
Quite right. And also there's another element there I might add, which is when we talk about the vote, very seldom do we talk about limiting the purpose of the vote. Voting for what? Okay, we vote for people. Now, that's simple enough. Then the implication is that, well, if 51% of the group nominates or votes for a person or a group of people, and they get 51%, now they can do whatever they want to do. They can execute redheads, they can take your property, they can throw you in prison, they can relocate you because they got 51% of the vote. See, the training we've had does not distinguish between voting and the next part is voting for what? See, the idea is we can vote for anything.
Right. I fully realized this when, after several governments came and went in this nation. I've been a U.S. citizen for the last couple of years now. And I, as an individual, believe very strongly in the Founding Fathers' vision for this nation as being different and distinct from any other nation on the planet. Of course, we've come a long way from there, not necessarily in the right direction. But when I realized that whether I voted Republican or Democrat, my nation was going to war, and I didn't agree with why they were going to war. I mean, don't get me wrong, if a foreign nation invades the United States, absolutely we should defend ourselves. But to be over making war in multiple nations around the world and benefiting the companies that are all in the global elite clique that basically benefits from the sale of arms and, petroleum assets, etc., I realized that whether I voted Democrat or Republican, my vote didn't count. That made me realize that if I wanted any change to occur, I had to get involved in one way or another.
Well, yes, and the ultimate involvement is to run for office yourself or find somebody who has the right view and do everything you can to see that they're running for office. And the rest of that is make sure it's not on the Republican or Democrat ticket. And unless you have the ability to resist the influence of the heads of the Republican and Democrat Party, then it would be all right. Who cares what party you run under, whether
Right.
it's Republican, Democrat, Independent, as long as you are truly independent of the influence at the top of those parties. But very few candidates are capable of doing that. So that's why I really have a very dour view of both Republican and Democrat parties, because I know that their leadership for many decades has been committed to collectivism and internationalism.
Right. And so let's come back to that. Let's really look at that a little bit more closely then. I wanted to get more into talking about health. You've written a wonderful book on Laetrile as a very successful cure for cancer. But let's continue with where we are now, and I'd love to have you on at a future date to talk, about the cancer debacle, because I think it's a very big subject that we could get into at length. Why is individual freedom the key to success rather than the growth of a collectivist state and a collectivist social state? And what is the difference between individualism and collectivism? I mean, I understand it, but I don't know necessarily whether all of the listeners understand just how far we've moved towards a collectivist model.
Well, I can guarantee you that most people do not know the difference any more than I did at one time, not too long ago. I was not taught those words in school. I've since learned that collectivism and individualism were words that were quite deeply embedded in the English language 80 years or 100 years ago. People knew what those words meant, and they used them a lot. But today, you hardly ever hear them. We're doing our best here at Freedom Force International to get them back into the vocabulary, and with some success, I'm happy to report. But anyway, the question is, what's the difference? Well, it's the difference between night and day. There are certain elements that you find in both philosophies of collectivism and individualism, but in both cases, the view of those elements is just the opposite. For example, I just give you one or two here. The origin of rights is one that's very important. Individualists believe that human rights come with the human, he's born with them. They're intrinsic. They're undeniable, as our founding fathers wrote, inalienable, or I think they wrote unalienable. That was the word they used in those days. Today we say inalienable rights. And it's the difference between software and hardware. It's hardware. Individuals believe we have the rights. Collectivists believe that we are born with no rights, but the state or the government gives us our rights. Well, that's a night and day difference right there. And if you take a look at all of the collectivist documents in the world, the constitutions of collectivist states, such as the Soviet Union or Communist China or the United Nations for that matter, it states in those documents that rights are derived from the state. And that's important because if the state can give you your rights, then the state can take them away.
And we saw that with the Patriot Act. Yeah, we saw that with the Patriot Act, Yeah,
exactly. You can't argue against that. If you say, well, the state can give me my rights, then you have no argument when the state takes them away. You might say, oh, you shouldn't do that, but still the state has the right to do it. Well, that's one example. Another example would be the difference between the group and the individual. Collectivists believe that the group is more important than the individual, and that the individual must be sacrificed, if necessary, for the greater good of the greater number. And individualists believe, no, just the other way around. In fact, individualists believe there is no such thing as a group. When you think about it, that's right. A group doesn't exist. It's an abstract concept. It's something that appears in the mind, but you can't touch a group. All you can touch are individuals. It's the same as the word forest. There's no such thing as a forest except as an abstraction in the mind. All that really exists are trees. So this is the abstraction for many trees. Well, the group is the same way. The only real thing in this world are individuals. Groups do not exist except theoretically. So if you say that the group has rights that are more important than the individual, you've made a big mistake because, first of all, the group doesn't exist. And that means that somebody who claims to represent the group, be some great leader, some demagogue, or somebody who's been elected, it doesn't make any difference. Some leader or some small group of people will say, we will declare what is best for the group. And then the individuals and the minorities get wiped out, you see. And all of the great catastrophes of modern history, the great crimes of modern history, have been done under the guise of being for the greater good of the greater number.
Right. And I think if there's something that kind of comes out of that, what you're talking about, and that's leadership in its nature. I mean, leadership can disempower the individual, or it can rally the individual. A strong leadership can encourage self-reliance rather than creating reliance.
Yeah.
But I think people need to be educated and aware in order to understand when leadership is moving into a demagogic behavior rather than a behavior that helps to further the cause of individuals.
Yes, and I think the experience of the American Revolution was a perfect example. At the end of the war, the colonists had won, and it was time to find a new leader, have a new government. And the American colonists wanted the same thing that they had in Germany. They wanted George Washington to be the new king. They didn't have any problem with kings. They just didn't like George II over in England. They didn't like that king. But now that we won the war, they said, let's have our own king, And Washington and Jefferson and others said, hey, no. This is our chance to rewrite the rules. This is our chance to do something different. We will not have a king. We will not have a royalty. And, they launched something that was a brand new experience in history, where the power was derived from the people, not from the king or the royalty. So there was a case, as you said, of leadership offering a motivation for people to become self-reliant, as opposed to today we've got people who really want to be kings. In fact, they have achieved that. They don't call them kings anymore, but they have all the privileges of the royalty of old. In fact, our president and the presidents of other countries in today's world, I think, have more power, absolute monarchical power, than any king of history.
Right. So a question with somewhat of a humorous note, but also a great deal of meaning behind it, on reading between the lines, is how do we get back to the George who helps further the Republic rather than the George that destroys the Republic?
Well, that's what we're trying to do with our programs and our books and our talk shows and our lectures and all of that sort of thing. I think the only way to do that is to bring that logic and that history back to the attention of the American people. They're not getting it at school. They're not getting it on their television. They're not getting it in their newspapers. So it's got to come from us, from the alternative media. That's the only way.
That's very true, and I mean, but again, it implies an involvement in your own reality. As individuals, we cannot expect mainstream media and government to tell us the truth, to give us the truth, because they would not benefit from the truth. We would benefit from the truth, and that's why we have to choose the truth, rather than listen to and basically jump into the bath of ideology.
That's a big order, isn't it?
It is.
And the question is, how many people will actually respond to that challenge? And the bad news is that probably not too many. But the good news is that it doesn't take a lot. If we only had about 3% of the population that did exactly what you were talking about, and more than that, but they stepped forward and offered themselves as leaders and became influential in the power centers of society, not just riders in the boat, but pullers at the oars. 3% is all it has ever taken in history to redirect the course of history. So that's the good news. And we still have a long way to go to that 3% mark, but hey, we're getting there.
Now, let me ask you, I'm sure a lot of our listeners this evening would be very interested in reading more of your books and also learning more about the freedom initiatives that you've helped found. Could you tell us a little bit more about how they can find out more information, not just about your books, but especially about the movement that you've helped further?
Yes. Thanks for that. Yeah, I'd like to do that very much. We have two websites and one internet service. So let me just mention them briefly. The think tank website, as we call it, is our organizational website. It's for freedomforceinternational.org. It's an organization. And we have members now in about 68 different countries. We're all over the world because we find out that these issues, this conflict between collectivism and individualism, is everywhere in the world. And so we're trying to create a network of people who understand the issues and who are helping each other to come back to acquire positions of influence within the power centers of society. We have nothing to sell on that website, but we got a lot of information and a lot of thought-provoking issues. So anybody that wants to become part of the solution and not just complain about the problem, they should start, I think, at freedomforceinternational.org. Now, we have a commercial site where we sell things. That's called the Reality Zone. And we've got about 100 different books and audio recordings and video recordings there on various topics. All of the stuff that I've written is there, and there's plenty to keep you busy at Reality Zone. Easy to remember, realityzone.com. And then, for those who want to see what we think is going on in the news on a daily basis, we have a free news service. It's called Unfiltered News. And you can sign up for that. You can take a look at some sample issues, see what's up there right now. I personally edit that. I work on it quite a bit every week, and we update it about 4 times a week. And a new issue, a whole complete new issue, goes out every Friday. So take a look at that, and you can just Google it at Unfiltered News.
Is that unfiltered unfilterednews.com or .org or?
Well, you'll find it actually on the Reality Zone.
Okay.
.com. It's one of the features on Reality Zone. You can go to it through Reality Zone, or you can go directly through Google and just say Unfiltered News and get to it.
Excellent, because ultimately truth and information comes, I believe, from the ability to discern rather than accepted what is being fed to us. And the mainstream media does a very good job. They have people that study how to influence people's thought, and they they use color, they use shape, they use all sorts of psychological and emotional and mental devices to get people to believe their truth. They use it for advertising to convince people to eat garbage. But ultimately, we need to become a true individual who is an individual with power and strength, is an individual who is educated on many different issues. So I think part of our detriment is this whole, I'm not saying it's not good to develop oneself strongly in one area, but I think it behooves us to strengthen ourselves in multiple areas so that we can make more rational and informed decisions in many areas of our lives.
Well, I certainly agree with that, and that's one of the goals of our Unfiltered News service, because we comb through all the news services around the world constantly, and it's amazing how often the truth can be found right in mainstream media sources, but it's buried. The way they're twisted or filtered, as we call it, they use adjectives and phraseology that creates an impression, an emotional impression that's contrary to the reality. And yet, if you look at the facts, they're there. Maybe somebody is described as President so and so, when in reality he's a dictator, for example. But because they like him and he's a collectivist, they present him as the president or the chancellor or something like that. And if they don't like him, they'll call him a dictator or strongman or drug dealer or something like that. But if you get past all those adjectives and the twisting and look at the facts, quite often the facts are accurate. So our job is to take those stories and unfilter them. And it's amazing how the truth really is right in front of our eyes much of the time, but you'd never recognize it because of the filters.
Right, and if you have the truth, folks, you can act on that truth and make decisions that will greatly affect your health and the health of your family on many different levels. And we're not talking just, whether you look healthy physically, but whether your mind works in a healthy manner, whether your emotions are healthy, whether the country you're living in, the community you're in is healthy, because the community we live in is an extension of us, literally. And if we're involved in it, we can make changes. And that activism and involvement is so crucial. So I really encourage you to get in there, listen to or read and listen to some of the information on freedomforceinternational.org and Google Unfiltered News. Go to the realityzone.com and get some of these titles, read them, learn, empower yourself through knowledge. It's such a crucial and important thing. And Ed, I hope I can get you on the show again soon. We can talk Laetrile and the cancer debacle.
Well, that would be great, Darren. I'll be glad to do that. Thanks for inviting me.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Folks, tune in next week. Really loved having this show. Again, thank you so much, Ed, for being on the show this evening. It was a wonderful and enjoyable and very informative show.
Broadcasting to the U.S. and around the world by way of clear digital audio, 22,500 miles above the planet. This is the Global Star Radio Network.
and are easy to set up, take down, and move anywhere. Available in 2 sizes. Get your Turtle Tough shelter and